The judge's gavel came down and the room went quiet in a way I had never heard before. Not the quiet of an empty church or a winter morning. The quiet of people holding their breath because something had just gone very wrong for someone who thought everything was going very right. My wife's attorney was standing at her table with a stack of papers in her hand, and her face had gone the color of old milk. I sat with my hands folded on the table in front of me, and I did not smile. I had promised myself I would not smile. Let me tell you how we got there. My name is Richard. I am 63 years old. I spent 31 years building a precision parts manufacturing company out of a rented garage in Dayton, Ohio. Starting with $12,000 I borrowed from my father and a notebook full of designs I had drawn by hand on graph paper during my lunch breaks at the factory where I used to work. The notebook was my father's first. He had been a machinist his whole life, and when he retired he gave me the notebook and said, "Your ideas are better than mine were. Do something with them." He died 4 years later, before the business became anything worth talking about. I kept the notebook in the top drawer of my desk for 31 years. I want you to understand what the company was before I tell you what my wife tried to take from me. It was not just a business. It was the result of my father getting up at 4:30 in the morning for 40 years so that I could have something to start with. It was Saturday afternoons I missed when my daughter Emma was small, and Sunday evenings I spent in the office instead of watching movies on the couch, and every vacation I cut short because a client needed something by Monday. It was real. It was mine. And for most of those 31 years, I believed it was ours. My wife and I met when we were both 29. She was working in accounting at a firm downtown. She was sharp and funny, and she understood numbers the way some people understand music, instinctively, without having to think too hard. I admired that about her. We got married 2 years later, and when Emma was born, she took some time away from work and then came back, and eventually I brought her into the company to handle the financials. It made sense. We trusted each other. Or I trusted her. I want to be accurate about that. For a long time, things were good. Not perfect, because nothing is perfect, but genuinely good in the ways that matter. We raised Emma together. We built the business together. We had Friday night dinners at a restaurant we had gone to since our first year of marriage. And we still ordered the same things we had ordered on our first date there, which I always thought was a good sign. I cannot tell you exactly when things changed because I did not see it clearly until much later. Looking back, I can find the edges of it, the moments that felt slightly off in ways I could not name at the time. A phone call she took outside in the cold instead of inside where it was warm. A weekend conference that she mentioned and then never mentioned again. A change in the way she looked at me, not with hostility but with a kind of assessment, like she was measuring something. About 3 years before the divorce, we brought in a man named Gerald to help manage the company's growth. He had a background in business development and came recommended by someone we both knew. He was organized and persuasive, and he had a way of making every plan sound inevitable. My wife liked him immediately. I noticed that too, but I told myself it was a professional admiration. I was 60 years old and I had been married for 30 years, and I did not want to be the kind of man who sees threats where there are none. I started to see the truth slowly, the way you see a shape in fog. First I noticed that her conversations with Gerald lasted longer than they needed to. Then I noticed that she had started coming home later on nights when I knew Gerald had also stayed late. Then one evening I found a message on her phone that I was not trying to find, that I saw only because she had left it open on the kitchen counter when she went to answer the door. I did not confront her that night. I stood in the kitchen with her phone in my hand for about 4 minutes, and then I put it back exactly where it had been, and I went and sat in the living room, and I did not say a single word about what I had seen. I need you to understand that I am not a man who plans revenge. I want to be clear about that. What I did in the months that followed was not about punishment. It was about protection. Protection of the one thing that mattered more to me than the company or the house, or 30 years of a marriage that had apparently been running on fumes for longer than I knew. I called my attorney the next morning. Not a divorce attorney. My business attorney. A man named Paul who had helped me structure the company from the beginning and who knew every asset and patent and contract we had ever signed. I told him what I suspected. I told him what I wanted to do. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "Richard, I want you to think carefully before you make any moves." I told him I had already thought carefully. I had been thinking carefully since the night before, when my whole marriage rearranged itself in 4 minutes in a kitchen. Over the following months, I worked with Paul to do something that was entirely legal, fully documented, and absolutely irreversible. The company held 19 patents on precision machining processes that I had developed over the years. Those patents were the real value of the business. The physical equipment could be replaced. The client contracts had expiration dates, but the patents were the engine that made everything run, and they were worth considerably more than anything else we owned. With Paul's guidance, I established an irrevocable trust. The beneficiary was Emma. I transferred all 19 patents into that trust. The transfer was properly valued, properly documented, and filed with every relevant authority. It was not a secret. It was a legal transaction. No one asked about it at the time because there was no reason to ask about it. The company still functioned the same way. The patents were still being used. The income still flowed. From the outside, nothing had changed. What had changed was that my wife could never touch them. I want to tell you something about Emma before I go further, because she is the reason I did any of this, and I do not want her to just be a name in a story. She was 16 at the time, almost 17. She was serious in the way that some kids are serious, not cold, but genuinely thoughtful. She liked to read on the back porch in the evenings, and she had a habit of writing notes in the margins of her books in very small handwriting. She played the violin badly and refused to give it up, which I respected. She got her grandmother's stubbornness and her grandfather's curiosity and somehow managed to make those two things work together in a way that neither of them had managed individually. She also knew something was wrong at home. Kids that age always know. She did not ask me directly, but one evening she came and sat next to me in the garage while I was going through some old files, and she did not say anything for a while. And then she said, "Dad, are you okay?" And I said I was working on it. And she nodded like that was a real answer, which it was. I did not tell her what I was doing with the trust. I did not want to put that weight on her. But I made sure that Paul had everything documented in a way that Emma would understand when the time came. And I made sure that what I was building for her could not be undone by anyone. My wife filed for divorce 14 months after I found that message on the kitchen counter. She told me on a Thursday evening in October. She sat across from me at the kitchen table and said that she had not been happy for a long time and that she thought it was better for both of us to move forward separately. She used the word separately the way people use it when they have been practicing what they are going to say. She was calm. She had clearly been preparing for this conversation for a while. I told her I understood. She looked slightly surprised by that. I told her I would cooperate fully with the process. She looked more surprised. I told her I had already spoken to an attorney, which was true. I had spoken to a divorce attorney 3 months earlier, in addition to Paul, specifically to understand what the process would look like and what my rights and obligations were. She hired an attorney named Patricia, who had a reputation for aggressive negotiation and for winning settlements that most people considered one-sided. I had heard of her. She was good at her job in the way that people are good at their jobs when their main goal is to take as much as possible. The list of what my wife wanted was long. The house, the investment accounts, half the company, structured as a buyout where I would pay her a fixed sum over 5 years, full access to all business financials going back 10 years. Her attorney presented this as a reasonable starting point. My attorney presented my response, which was this. I would give her everything she asked for. I want to tell you what happened when Patricia heard that, because it is important. According to my attorney, she paused for a moment, and then she said that her client had confirmed all the assets were accounted for and that this was acceptable. She did not ask for an independent valuation. She did not ask to review the company's current asset structure. She did not ask Paul any questions about the patents or the trust or any recent structural changes. She took my wife's word for what everything was worth. My attorney noted this. Paul noted this. I noted this. The settlement agreement was drafted. I reviewed every line. The company was listed at a valuation based on its revenue, its physical assets, and its contracts. The patents were not listed because the patents were no longer part of the company's holdings. They were in an irrevocable trust belonging to my daughter. This was a matter of public record. Anyone who looked would have found it. Patricia did not look. I signed the agreement. I signed the house over to my wife. I signed the investment accounts over to my wife. I agreed to the buyout structure for the company at the listed valuation. My wife's attorney submitted the final paperwork to the court. Now let me tell you about Emma. My wife had asked for custody. This is the word she used, custody. Even though Emma was 17, and in most practical senses, old enough to have a strong say in where she lived. The custody arrangement was a formality as much as anything, a legal structure for the remaining months before Emma turned 18. Emma chose to live with me. I do not know if my wife expected that. I do not know what she thought would happen, but Emma was clear. She spoke with the mediator, and she was polite and direct, and she said she wanted to live with her father, and that was that. My wife did not fight it. I have thought about that many times. I have thought about what it means that she spent so much energy securing the house and the accounts and the company, and then simply let Emma go without much more than a conversation. I do not say this to condemn her. People are complicated, and marriages end for reasons that are not always visible from the outside. But I know what my daughter felt when she realized her mother had not fought for her. I know it because she told me, one night about a month after everything was finalized, sitting in the kitchen of the apartment we had moved into together, eating pasta that neither of us had made very well. She said, "I thought she would at least argue." I said, "I know." She was quiet for a while, and then she said, "I'm glad I'm here." I told her I was too. The court hearing for the final settlement was on a Tuesday in March. The building was old, and the hallways smelled like floor wax and old coffee. I wore a gray suit that I had bought for a client meeting years earlier and had barely worn since. My attorney sat next to me. Paul was in the row behind us, not as a party to the proceedings, but because I had asked him to be there. My wife was across the room with Patricia. They had a stack of documents on the table in front of them, and they both looked prepared and organized and confident in a specific way that comes from believing you have already won. The judge was a woman in her late 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her head and the expression of someone who had seen every possible variation of human behavior in a courtroom and had long since stopped being surprised by any of it. She reviewed the settlement documents. She asked several standard questions. The answers were given. She moved efficiently through the paperwork, the way experienced judges do, with a kind of practiced attention that covers a lot of ground quickly. And then she stopped. She looked at a specific page. She turned back to an earlier page. She looked at the first page again. She said, "Counsel, I'm looking at the company valuation in this agreement. Can you walk me through how this figure was arrived at?" Patricia stood and gave the explanation that had been prepared. Revenue figures, physical assets, contract values. The methodology was standard and the numbers were documented. The judge said, "And the intellectual property?" Patricia said that the intellectual property was included in the overall valuation. The judge said, "I'm looking at a public filing from 14 months ago that indicates 19 patents previously held by this company were transferred to an irrevocable trust. Those patents are not reflected in this valuation. Can you explain the discrepancy?" The room went quiet. Patricia looked at my wife. My wife looked at Patricia. Patricia looked at the documents in front of her. She said she would need a moment to review the filing. The judge said that was fine, and waited. What followed was several minutes, during which Patricia reviewed documents that she should have reviewed many months earlier, and her expression moved through several distinct stages, starting with focused concentration, moving through something that looked like confusion, and arriving at something that I can only describe as a kind of controlled panic, held very tightly in check by professional training. My wife leaned over and said something to her in a low voice. Patricia said, in a voice that was considerably less steady than it had been 5 minutes earlier, that she needed to request a brief recess to consult with her client. The judge said that before she granted a recess, she would like to understand the basic facts. She looked at my attorney and asked him to confirm the patent transfer. My attorney confirmed it. He had the documentation. Paul, in the row behind us, had additional copies. The transfer had been made 14 months ago, was properly valued by an independent assessor at the time of the transfer, was filed with the Patent Office, and was in a trust that was irrevocable and not subject to division and divorce proceedings. All of this was a matter of public record. None of it had been concealed. Patricia said, in a voice that had gone very tight, that this was new information. My attorney said, respectfully, that it was not new information. It had been a matter of public record for 14 months. I will not describe in precise detail what happened next, because court proceedings are not theater, and the people involved are real. and some of what was said in distress. But I will tell you that Patricia's voice rose above the level that is standard for a courtroom, and that the judge had to use her gavel, and that my wife sat very still in her chair with her hands flat on the table in front of her. The settlement was not finalized that day. What followed over the next 6 weeks was a reassessment of everything. The company, stripped of the patents it had been valued with, was worth a fraction of the agreed buyout figure. The assets my wife had secured in the settlement were real. The house was real. The investment accounts were real. But the prize she thought she was taking, the engine of the business, the 19 patents that made the company worth what she believed it to be worth, those belonged to Emma. She could keep everything she had agreed to. That was her choice. But the company without the patents was not the company she thought she was getting a piece of. Her attorney had agreed to a valuation that reflected a business structure that no longer existed. I want to say something here that I have said to only 2 people before writing it now. I did not do what I did to hurt her. I transferred those patents to Emma because Emma deserved them. Because my father's ideas and my ideas had been turned into something real over 30 years, and that something real belonged to the person who came after me, not to a settlement negotiated by someone who had not bothered to check the public record. I gave my wife everything she asked for. I signed every paper. I disputed nothing. I just made sure that what was mine to give was already gone to where it belonged. The buyout for the company was renegotiated at the new valuation. The difference was significant. My wife's attorney filed a motion challenging the patent transfer. The motion was denied. The transfer had been made legally, more than a year before divorce proceedings began, for documented consideration, and there was no legal basis to challenge it. The court found nothing improper. My wife kept the house. She kept the investment accounts. She got a smaller buyout on the company. She and Gerald eventually did move in together, which I heard about through someone we both used to know. Emma and I moved into a rental house about 12 minutes from her high school. It was smaller than the house she had grown up in, and the kitchen was too narrow, and one of the windows in the living room had a draft that we never fully fixed. She made it her own anyway. She put plants on every windowsill and a worn rug on the living room floor and hung photographs in the hallway in an arrangement that she planned out on paper before she put a single nail in the wall. She turned 18 4 months after the court hearing. On her birthday, I took the notebook out of my desk drawer. My father's notebook, the one he had given me when I was starting out, with his handwriting on the first pages and my handwriting filling every page after that. The one that had sat in that drawer for 31 years while the ideas inside it became a real business. I gave it to her. She held it for a long time without saying anything. She turned the first pages slowly and looked at her grandfather's handwriting, which she had seen before, but not like this, not understanding what it meant yet. I told her that the patents were hers now, that the trust would transfer to her control when she turned 25, unless she needed access before then, which we could arrange through Paul if the situation called for it. I told her that the notebook was the beginning of all of it, and that I wanted her to have the beginning as well as everything that came after. She said, "Dad, this is..." and then she stopped and looked out the window for a moment and then looked back at me and said, "Thank you." I told her she was welcome. She asked me what I was going to do now. It was a genuine question. The company was still operating, but I had stepped back. I was 63. I had built something over 31 years, and now I had given the best part of it away on purpose, and she wanted to know what came next. I told her I had some ideas. She laughed. She said, "Of course you do. I want to be honest about something. There were nights during those months when I sat in the kitchen after Emma had gone to bed and I felt the weight of it. 30 years. A marriage. A house I had renovated with my own hands over summers and weekends. Dinners at a restaurant where we had always ordered the same things. That kind of loss does not become smaller just because you handled it correctly. It stays the size it is. But I also want to be honest about something else. There was a morning about a month after the court hearing when I was driving to meet Paul for coffee, and the sun was coming through the windshield at the angle it comes through in early spring in Ohio, low and direct and surprisingly warm, and I had the radio on to nothing in particular, and I realized that I was not dreading the day. That sounds like a small thing, but it was not a small thing. I had been dreading most days for a long time without fully admitting that to myself. The company continued to license the patents from the trust at a fair market rate that Paul and I had structured carefully. It remained profitable. Emma, when she was ready, would have the choice to do something with those patents herself, or to license them, or to let them continue as they were. The decision would be hers. I hear people sometimes talk about revenge like it is a fire you have to light under someone, like the satisfaction comes from watching something burn. I am 63 years old, and I do not think about it that way. What I did was not revenge. I did not take anything from anyone. I gave what was mine to the person it belonged to, and I did it before anyone could take it from me. My wife had a good attorney who chose not to do her job carefully because she trusted that her client had already checked. Her client trusted that I was the same man I had been for 30 years, methodical and quiet and unlikely to surprise anyone. She was right about the methodical part. The courtroom went quiet that Tuesday in March. I sat with my hands folded on the table and I did not smile. And the judge looked at a piece of paper, and Patricia's voice went tight, and my wife sat very still with her hands flat in front of her. I got what I protected. I paid a real price to get it. I would pay it again. Emma called me last Sunday evening. She is in her second year of engineering school now. She called to tell me about a project she is working on, something involving materials and tolerances that I understood better than she expected me to, which made her laugh. We talked for almost an hour. Before she hung up, she said, "Hey, Dad." I said, "Yeah." She said, "I've been reading the notebook." I asked her what she thought. She was quiet for a second, and then she said, "I think I have some ideas." I told her I would be happy to hear them. I meant it completely.